Okay, so the first Rashi that we're going to discuss involves one of the earlier interactions between Yaakov and Yosef. So Yaakov is asking Yosef that he will is asking to be buried in outside of Egypt, and he's asking for him to be buried with chesed and emet, chesed ve'emet, with truth and kindness. And Rashi's picking up a little bit of like, what exactly does the word emet mean in this context? Like, what is it serving to truth? Like, what really are we getting to? And Rashi explains that caring for a deceased person is really the truest emet kind of kindness, the truest kind of form of kindness that someone can display, because it can't really be reciprocated. There's no give and take, and when you give something to the deceased, there's no reciprocation, and there's nothing that you can expect or really get in return. So on those words, we're kind of learning about this almost like mitzvah to the deceased. Moving on, just really by a matter of two words, Rashi also picks on chesed ve'emet el na. So he's specifically asking not to be buried in Egypt, but why? So we kind of like at first hand accept that he doesn't want to be buried in Egypt, but Rashi's picking up like, why doesn't he want to be buried in Egypt, and what can we learn from the fact that he doesn't want to? So there are three possible answers that Rashi gives. Perhaps one of the answers, one of the reasons why Yaakov is making this specification is that the dirt of Egypt actually will turn into lice, so that it's like an unsanitary way to be buried. And a second answer that's given is that when the dead are revived, it will be less painful for those who are buried in Israel. So it's almost like a less painful experience to be buried outside of Egypt, specifically in Israel. And also that perhaps the Egyptians would have come to worship his body. And that's not a way in which he wanted to be treated in his burial or in memoriam. So those are like kind of starting out the first two that we're going to focus on in terms of Rashi. But moving forward through the Parsha, there's continuing in this conversation between Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov kind of mentions the fact that Rachel, Yosef's mother, was indeed not buried in Israel herself. And so there's kind of this interaction between Yaakov and Yosef about almost like the painful memory of Rachel's burial, and Yaakov explaining himself as to why she was buried kind of on the way near Beit Lechem, and separate from everyone else, that she was buried en route. She didn't make it to the destination, and she is in fact separate. Kever Rachel is separate from everyone. So why? So Rashi's asking why. You know, we see this interaction between them. We know it to be true. And why? Why there? So why specifically in this spot? V'yakrav Sham. So Yaakov saw that the Jewish people would pass through Kever Rachel. They would pass through Rachel's tomb on their way out of exile towards Israel, towards Jerusalem, and would therefore give Rachel the opportunity for them to plea on their behalf. So almost as like it was a very strategic location or spot for her burial, so that en route people would be able to stop and daven, and she would merit that. And it is in fact a way in which we utilize Kever Rachel today. So they've kind of moved on towards this conversation, or this heart-to-heart, if you will, between father and son. And all of a sudden, Yaakov then calls in for Ephraim and Manasseh, who are Yosef's sons. And Yaakov wants to give them a blessing. So he wants to bless Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh is actually the older son, so Manasseh and Ephraim. And there's kind of this like strategic positioning. I happen to have read it several times to kind of understand or to be able to visualize what exactly was happening. But in short, Yaakov requests the two boys, and Yosef brings them and he positions them. And he positions them in a way where Manasseh, the older son, would receive a blessing from the right hand of Yaakov as he is older and the more dominant hand. So he kind of like strategically places the boys. The text explains almost confusingly, who's left, who's right. But ultimately, Yaakov is there and Manasseh is on his right and Ephraim is on his left. And there's a mix-up. So what happens is, just looking in the text, we see that Yaakov actually reaches out for his right hand to be over Ephraim, the younger son. And Yosef saw this and kind of interjects, and he's like, this is the younger son. Your right hand should be placed on Manasseh. And Yaakov explains that he is very much so intentionally doing this. And he does not necessarily mean to bless Manasseh with his right hand just because he's older. So the interaction continues that Yosef's kind of like, why? And Yaakov simply explains that Ephraim is going to surpass Manasseh. So what Rashi is kind of picking up on is how exactly he would do that. Like, is it a given that he's going to, and how or why? And he explains in his commentary that Yehoshua, who is the great leader following Moshe, who constructs the Aron and really introduces the Torah to the Jewish people, is going to be a descendant of Ephraim. And therefore, Ephraim is greater because Yehoshua was in fact one of the greatest leaders, and Ephraim merits that relationship. So Ephraim, in fact, gets blessed first, and it's Ephraim and Manasseh. He comes first. And following that conversation of blessing, there's like an unclear language from Yaakov of like with Israel. He says that he's going to, that he begins to bless them, and that he says the children will be blessed they'll be blessed with what is unclear to Rashi. So, translated into English, it's, with what are they going to be blessed? So really, and some of you may or may not be familiar with this from your own Friday night experiences, but they will be blessed. Every single Jewish child or Jewish son will be blessed that they should be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And actually just something really nice that always makes me think about growing up is growing up in my house every Friday night, my dad would kind of bless everyone together. It would be like his inclusive. He would do one for the girls and one for the boys. But it wouldn't be that each kid would get their own blessing, Ephraim, Manasseh, but it would be that everyone, he has this like inclusive, everyone at the table. Maybe we were having guests over that didn't know the blessing, and it was just a really nice way of including everyone at the table in one way. All of the kids, if they weren't with their parents, or if parents didn't want to do it or didn't know how to, it was just something that growing up is one of my favorite things to think about in my house, is really just this like little moment that my dad would kind of extend out his like hands to everyone at the table and would give like a big collective blessing to everyone. And it really all comes from Parshas Vayechi.